And hello, friends. Good to be with you. Before we dive into the discussion, Feeding Homo Sapiens, What We Know and How We Know It, first of all, if you paid attention to that video, I'm pleased to report I have managed to get a haircut. So the last time I attended this conference, I guess it was early in the pandemic when all that was very difficult. But things did improve on that front. And actually, just a quick anecdote from the last time I attended in person, and it's worth starting there because, of course, this is lovely, nice to have this opportunity to address you, uh, but it's better to be in the same place at the same time, so we all look forward to getting that normal back. But the last time we had it, I was looking for something to eat at the hotel that was playing host to this conference just before my talk. And the best option was a quinoa salad in the lobby restaurant. So I ordered that, and it wasn't bad, really. But interestingly, the server asked me, inevitably, do you want protein with that? And of course, protein meant, chicken or fish or shrimp, the usual suspects. And I trust most of you know quinoa is an excellent protein source. And I start with that anecdote just to say how insidious the distortions about diet and health are. We talk all the time in our culture about protein, and it's basically a tag to mean meat or animal foods. And that entire dialogue is oblivious to the fact that you can be a vegan and have more than adequate protein intake, both in quantity and quality. But again, it infiltrates our culture. And so almost everywhere you go, no matter what you're doing, the distortion is there to greet you and to lead you astray. So we should not underestimate the magnitude of the challenge we face. We are working, and I do mean we, because the real privilege in being a speaker in front of an audience is to influence. And then with that influence, to have the message paid forward again and again and again. And, through 6 degrees of separation, we can get Kevin Bacon in on it. But that's really the point. It's not just conversation. It is, per the disclaimer, not about providing individual medical care. It's about important messages that collectively can translate into a revolution. We need a cultural revolution in terms of how we think about food, the role it plays. And that needs to reverberate through the very lexicon, how we talk about it. Again, every server in every chain restaurant in this country, however many millions of encounters that may represent every day, is asking that kind of question. Would you like protein with that? It already has quinoa. That doesn't count. It already has chickpeas. That doesn't count. Protein means meat. Protein is good. Therefore, meat is good. We have our work cut out for us. We have miles to go before we sleep. What we don't lack, though, is robust knowledge about the optimal care and feeding of Homo sapiens, and in particular, the optimal care and feeding of our kind of animal in a world that remains hospitable to every other kind of animal. The preservation of the beautiful places in nature, of biodiversity, this planet's greatest treasure. So let's talk about what we know and how we know it. We'll begin with what diet can do, our fundamental knowledge of the power, if you will, of diet. And of course, I'm well aware of the lineup of speakers into which I am configured here today. So some of these messages will be rather concordant with what you've heard, or perhaps are going to hear over the course of this conference. I think that's fine. I think as you sift through all of this to decide what matters most, what's most actionable, what's most reliable, where do you want to plant your feet knowing that the ground won't shift beneath you, it's likely to be those areas of confluence. I'll come to this before my talk is done, but I founded a nonprofit organization, the True Health Initiative, that was mentioned in the intro, and that exists to amplify and broadcast the science, the sense, and the global expert consensus about the fundamentals of healthy, sustainable eating and living. That third point, expert consensus, is really important, because if a lot of smart, well-educated people are examining the same space, absolutely there can be differences of opinion about details, but we ought to agree about the fundamentals. So as you listen to all these talks, think about, what was repeated? What are the themes that, are incontrovertible, because all the experts were saying that. They may have differed about some particular food or some particular source of oil, or, some preferred higher fat versus lower fat, but those are details. What are the fundamental details? So that's what I want to talk about. And it begins really with, as I say, the power of diet. So I finished my training in internal medicine in 1991, went on to Yale to do my preventive medicine training. And I completed my training in preventive medicine public health in 1993. So just shy of 30 years ago. And that year, just within a couple months of my graduation, this paper came out. And I always talk about this paper because it changed the course of my career, quite frankly. Actual causes of death in the United States. That's a pretty provocative title. What Mike McGinnis and Bill Foege did in this paper was look beyond the causes of death listed on death certificates and said, look, if somebody dies of a heart attack or heart failure secondary to a heart attack, and the cause of death is listed as atherosclerotic heart disease, we haven't learned anything. We already knew they had heart disease because they died of a heart attack. So you basically said the thing that they died of is the cause of death. But what we really want to know is what caused that? What caused the atherosclerosis? What's something fixable in this picture? So McGinnis and Foege answered that question, looking past the superficiality of the immediate cause of death. They basically said everything listed on a death certificate is an effect, not a cause. We want to know the causes of those effects, which are in turn the causes of death. And they answered that question. And I definitely commend to those of you who look at peer-reviewed papers, this one, if you haven't read it already. They enumerated a list of 10 factors which collectively account for all of the premature deaths in our country every year, but for a rounding error. What captivated my imagination and altered the trajectory of my career was the fact that just the first 3 things on this list of 10, just by themselves, accounted for 80% of the premature deaths every year, and also 80% of the burden of chronic disease. Those 3 things were tobacco, poor diet, lack of physical activity. And as some of you may have heard me say before, I've always referred to these ever since as bad use of feet, forks, and fingers. Those are the master levers of medical destiny. 80% of the premature deaths that occur in our country every year are bundled right there. When this was revisited 10 years later, it was still true. So a secondary analysis by, among others, the director of the CDC at the time, Julie Gerberding, reaffirmed that, in fact, almost all of the premature deaths in our country every year were preventable by means at our disposal, not just now in 2021, but way back then in 1993 and 2000. And tobacco, poor diet, lack of physical activity were still by far and away the leading causes. And 10 years after the initial analysis, the gap between tobacco as number 1 and bad use of feet and forks as number 2 had narrowed, mostly because we were smoking less, and thank goodness for that, but also because we were exercising less and eating just as badly, if not worse. So not all the news was good. So this was the lay of the land. This, if you will, was the epidemiologic landscape into which my career was launched. And what it did to me and my career was induce me to say, look, I want to be a physician, take care of patients. I know that. But I also intend to be a clinical researcher. And when I first started thinking about that, I thought the way all researchers think. I want to ask the next, as yet unasked, really interesting, important question, and then try to generate a meaningful answer. But when I looked at this, I said, we already have the answers. We're just not doing anything with them. We already know how to prevent 80% of premature deaths and 80% of the burden of chronic disease. And, to appreciate the full magnitude of that, just stop and think about your own personal network, people you love, your friends and family, and think about every case of cancer or diabetes or heart attack or heart failure or stroke or dementia. I mean, all the bad stuff that plagues us in modern epidemiology. And now imagine, and you know, you could think even further about the day you got the news. And I mean, we've all lived through this many, many times. Imagine if 8 times in 10, that never happened. 8 out of 10 of those people never got any of that stuff. That's what 80% less chronic disease and premature death would feel like in the world. It, you know, it would touch us all. Things that have invaded our lives and our families wouldn't 80% of the time. It's really quite astounding. So I looked at this literature and said, if we already know how to prevent 80% of premature death and chronic disease, and we're not doing much of anything with it, I'm going to have to let somebody else ask the questions about the residual 20%. I'm going to have to devote my career and every ounce of my strength to turning what we already know into what we routinely do. We say knowledge is power, but our lack of use of what we know belies that. Knowledge is only power if you translate what you know into routine action. And these 30 years, we've not been doing that. So that became the basis for my career, my clinical work, my writing, my teaching, my journalism, and the research that I did at Yale. Let's flash forward from 2000 in the second of those papers to a year and a half ago, August 26, 2019. This was an op-ed in the New York Times. Our food is killing too many of us. It was authored by Dariush Mozaffarian, Dean of Nutrition at Tufts, and Dan Glickman, former Secretary of Agriculture of the United States. I definitely commend this op-ed to you if you haven't read it. In it, these two authors cite the primary peer-reviewed literature that makes the case that poor diet quality is responsible for over 500,000 premature deaths in the United States all by itself. And that's every year. Now, we can't ignore the fact that we're meeting virtually because of COVID. We can't ignore the fact that we're having this conversation about health and food and all the rest during a pandemic. When the pandemic took us across the threshold of more than 500,000 premature deaths, it was a tragic, mournful milestone. And as a nation, we mourned it. And for anyone who suffered pandemic losses, my heartfelt condolences. I think we probably all have at this point at one remove or another. And it may interest you to know that I got COVID several months ago, and I'm happy to tell you about my experience if you like during the Q&A. But when the pandemic took more than 500,000 lives from our national community, it was a tragic milestone. And I'm here today to tell you that poor diet quality does that every year. And we don't mourn it, and we don't grieve, and we don't have services to acknowledge it, and we don't have moments of silence. It hides in plain sight. We are seemingly oblivious to it. But how can we be oblivious to it when there are op-eds about it in the New York Times by past secretaries of agriculture? How can we not be outraged? How can we not react to this? SARS-CoV-2, the virus, is not something over which we have complete control, but the food supply is. We produce it, and it kills more than 500,000 people a year. It's truly unconscionable. Every time I get the opportunity, you know, it used to be at a podium, it will be again soon. For now, it's, you know, the Zoom interface. But every time I get in front of a crowd of people to talk about this stuff, I get myself all worked up, and I want to know, where is the outrage? Diet kills as many people every year as the pandemic killed in this past year, and it hides in plain sight. It's just business as usual. To quote Supertramp, breakfast in America, and on we go. We ought to be outraged. This is a scandal. But what it means is that whereas diet was one of the top 3 causes of premature death and chronic disease when my career began in 1993, it is now the leading cause of premature death. Period, full stop, drop the mic. Thanks for coming. Diet is the leading cause of premature death and chronic disease in the modern world. And it's around the modern world. It's not just the US. So we are, and this is a very dubious distinction, we are the epicenter of the global pandemic of bad eating and bad health. But we have very effectively exported our bad dietary habits and our bad food products. And so the Global Burden of Disease study has looked at dietary factors and all-cause mortality and chronic disease in developed countries all around the world. And basically, diet is the #1 indicator of adverse health status in the entire developed world at this point. And little by little, we're taking over every other country too, with hyper-processed junk food and processed meats and animal food heavy diets. And this trend has to be stopped. This is a pandemic, and this is a global travesty because it's one we know full well how to prevent. Now, that's a bit gloomy. The good news is we can flip the coin around, look at the other face, and tell the same story from a happier perspective. I particularly like this study by Earl Ford and colleagues at the CDC, Healthy Living is the Best Revenge. This was back in 2009. They looked at 23,000 adults living in and around Potsdam, Germany. And for the sake of expediency, I'll just cut to the chase. They compared people who didn't smoke, ate well, and that was simply defined as routine intake of vegetables, fruits, and whole grains, were physically active and had a healthy weight, to people who smoked, didn't eat well, so did not have habitual intake of vegetables, fruits, and whole grains, were not physically active and had an unhealthy weight. These people who had those four things going for them, over the multi-year span of the study, had an 80% lesser incidence, lesser rate of all major chronic disease than these people. If you flip the switch from bad to good for any one of these factors, the probability of developing any major chronic disease goes down about 50%. But if you fire on all four cylinders, it goes down a staggering 80%. And I say staggering because ask yourself this. Imagine if there were a drug available, FDA approved, free of side effects, perfectly safe, inexpensive, accessible to all, and taken once daily. It would reduce your risk of ever getting any major chronic disease, heart disease, cancer, stroke, diabetes, dementia, etc., by 80%. I mean, who wouldn't want that prescription? Well, we have it. It just doesn't come in a pill. It's diet and lifestyle. And we've known about that for 30 years at least, if not since Hippocrates. So this is a happy story too, because that latent power is there for us to exploit. And ideally, we would exploit it at the level of our whole culture and society. But, you know, you and I don't need to keep waiting on the world to change. To borrow from John Mayer, we can take matters into our own hands and say, I want some of that. My people, my family, my tribe, 80% lesser risk of all major chronic disease. Yeah, sign me up. Well, that's what this represents. And this is a rich and repetitive literature. So these findings, 80% less chronic disease, premature death when you get diet and a few aspects of lifestyle right, reaffirmed in study after study, and quite frankly, after study, after study, after study, after study. And I flash these references at you, now I guess to show you I've done my homework, but mostly just to show this truly is a repetitive drumbeat in the peer-reviewed literature. And of course, this is a very short illustrative list. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of studies spanning decades showing with unbelievable consistency that if you get diet and lifestyle right, your probability of developing any major chronic disease goes down 80%. It's just about 80% every time. And that numerical or quantitative consistency across studies, across populations, across geography, across time is really remarkable. What it tells us is this is true. This is reliably true. We know this. It's not up for debate. That's how I feel about it. So the power of diet is incontrovertible. What is the extent of that power? Well, it reverberates to within the double helix of DNA. You all remember the excitement as we entered the genomic age, and you know we were going to have everybody's genome mapped, and the idea was we'd find what's broken in our genes and engineering would fix it. And of course, none of that panned out. Because very few of the diseases that most plague modern societies are monogenic. In other words, there isn't just a gene responsible for heart disease. It's a whole suite of genes that put you at risk. And the same for diabetes and obesity and dementia. So we have moved on from the notion that DNA is destiny. But we've also moved into the epigenetic era where we recognize that 95% of chromosomal real estate is not genes. 5% is genes. 95% is the epigenome. And the epigenome basically is a vast complex of levers and switches baked into our chromosomes that control what our genes do. And what controls what the epigenome does? Our diet and lifestyle. DNA is not destiny. Dinner is. because what we eat at dinner, lunch, breakfast, snacks, our activity, our environments, our overall health, and the formula I like to talk about is feet, forks, fingers. I already talked about those, right? So physical activity, dietary pattern, avoiding toxins like tobacco, excess alcohol. The rest of the formula is sleep. We need enough. Stress, we have to avoid too much. And love, strong social connections. Feet, forks, fingers, sleep, stress, love. The six-cylinder engine of lifestyles medicine, that is destiny. Because that formula will alter the output of your very genes. We can change gene expression when we change our behavior and lifestyle. Dinner is destiny. So the power of diet doesn't stop where DNA begins. It insinuates itself there. And speaking of chromosomal architecture, we actually know that lifestyle can change that too. The very composition of the chromosomes. So these green caps here at the ends of these chromosomes are telomeres. And you've likely heard that telomeres are one of the more potent correlates of healthy lifespan. The longer your telomeres, the longer healthy life is likely to be. I say likely because you can have long telomeres. It's still a really bad idea to stand in front of a moving train, for example. But other things being equal, long telomeres means long, healthy life, not just living long and prospering with vitality. Longevity plus vitality, telomeres predict that. And in research associated with the Nobel Prize in Medicine for Elizabeth Blackburn at UCSF, it's been shown that lifestyle interventions can actually lengthen telomeres. And the lead author of this paper is a good friend to this audience and a good personal friend of mine, Dean Ornish. Really important work. So we can lengthen our telomeres. So we're starting to understand the intracellular mechanisms by which diet and lifestyle can translate into longevity and vitality. So, I've devoted my career to all of this, but I also got sucked into the vortex of pandemic response. I wrote an op-ed that ran in the New York Times. I wound up speaking to a couple of governors. I testified before the Senate Homeland Security Committee all in the past year. I was on every media outlet you can imagine. Maybe some of you saw me. Became quite friendly with Tom Friedman, the longtime columnist at the New York Times and three-time Pulitzer Prize winner, and he and I collaborated on many of his columns. And one of the messages I wanted to get out from the very beginning, and you can see how long ago this was February of last year, was that there already was a pandemic before we ever heard about SARS-CoV-2. We weren't waiting for a pandemic, we were in a pandemic. We were in a pandemic of bad diet, bad lifestyle, chronic disease. And however big the COVID-19 pandemic proves to be, and we didn't know back then, this was a year ago, February, however big it proves to be, it's not going to be as big as the pandemic of diet-induced obesity and chronic disease, because that's beyond the scale of any infectious disease pandemic, because it's every year forever. It's been going on for decades, and just taking innumerable years from lives and life from years. So what about that? Because that is almost certainly going to translate into a greater toll in the SARS-CoV-2 pandemic, because it's not good to get an infectious disease while already sick. And an awful lot of Americans, and for that matter, people all around the world, are already sick. This is a crucial time to think about health promotion. This is a crucial time to think about improving diet, physical activity, and lifestyle as a means of fortifying ourselves against this pandemic. Alas, I was whistling into the wind. Hardly anybody's talked about this. Not the former administration, not the current administration. The idea that this is the perfect time for a national "Let's Get Healthy Together" campaign didn't catch on. I did what I could. I waved the flag. I made as much noise. But this fell into a socio-political blind spot because, coronary artery disease is a rite of passage in America. Nobody even notices. It's expected that at a certain age, you're going to have a stent or a bypass or angioplasty. It's just a given. Type 2 diabetes, geez, everybody gets that eventually, right? Hypertension, you get old enough, you have hypertension. There's no way to avoid that. I mean, that's how we think. These things are just expected to happen. And so it's fine that, we have animal food centric diets. It's fine that multicolored marshmallows are part of a child's complete breakfast. It's not fine. Our culture tells us it's all fine, it's all good, it's all normal. It's not fine, it's sure not good, it shouldn't be normal, you should be outraged. But this has direct implications for the mess we're in right now, because the massive toll of SARS-CoV-2 in the United States is mightily driven by our very poor cardiometabolic health coming into this pandemic. So colleagues and I went beyond just making noise in the media. We did some papers in the peer-reviewed literature, including this one in the Journal of Emerging Infectious Diseases, where we looked at the distribution in the US population of conditions that had already been identified as leading indicators of bad COVID outcomes. You're more likely to get hospitalized or wind up in the ICU or die if you have the following. And our findings indicated that 6 out of 10 American adults had at least one of these bad things. 4 out of 10 had 2 or more. So again, every way at our disposal, we were making noise about this. Come on, let's do something about this. That paper that we published was picked up by Nadia Popovich at the New York Times, who actually took it a step further and talked about how in communities of color, there really was a perfect storm, because you had a high burden of obesity and chronic disease before SARS-CoV-2, because you had basically food swamps and food deserts. So in environments that were conducive to eating badly, maybe environments where it wasn't safe to exercise outdoors. So, environments basically that conspired against cardiometabolic health. So high burdens of obesity, chronic disease, bad eating. And then many of the people living in disadvantaged neighborhoods are essential workers. So they're the very ones who couldn't stay home when the virus was circulating in the early going. So they have to go to work and be exposed. These were also neighborhoods often subject to severe stress because of racial injustice and other forms of social injustice. Perfect storm. And so what we've seen throughout the pandemic is these neighborhoods where there is a combination of disadvantages economically, demographically, have been hit terribly hard and suffered the greatest losses. So this at least got some attention in the New York Times, although we've not gone a long way toward fixing the problem. And obesity all by itself, which of course is a direct product of two things, obviously too many calories in, too few calories out, but overwhelmingly this is due to poor diets. Obesity is really the leading explanation for bad COVID outcomes in younger people. So this has huge relevance, not just across time, but at this time. We're living together, my friends, through a very unusual moment in history. It's been a very strange year we've all been through, and we're not quite out of the woods yet, although very close. We certainly can see the light at the end of the tunnel now. But we have to talk about that, and we have to look at the general status of our priorities and our approach to diet and lifestyle and health, and line all that up against what's going on right now. And the verdict is not good. We had a tremendous opportunity to mitigate the harms of this pandemic in many ways and failed to take advantage. So this is now getting more attention. There are other publications by other authors. Obesity seems to be one of the main explanations for massive differentials in mortality rates among countries around the year. And again, we have one of the worst. And not surprising, because we have one of the highest rates of obesity anywhere in the world. When my colleague Mary Adams looked at this, we saw much the same. And this is on the preprint server, not yet in the peer-reviewed literature. But we found marked differentials in COVID-related outcomes associated with obesity. And I saw this when I was on the front lines. I volunteered on the front lines during the surge in New York City just over a year ago, or maybe it was just exactly a year ago. I wound up being deployed in the Bronx in an emergency department. I saw patients for 30 years. I stopped seeing patients several years ago to focus on the public health aspects of my career, but I came out of clinical retirement. I'm still a licensed physician to volunteer and help out. And when I was on the front lines dealing with COVID exclusively, I saw the effects of cardiometabolic ill health. The people who were severely ill, we saw a lot of people with COVID who were not very ill, young people. The people who were severely ill were either older people with serious chronic disease, many coming by ambulance from nursing homes, or younger people, generally with severe obesity and the consequences of that, like type 2 diabetes. And we also had difficulty. We'd already figured out, or I should say, the medical system had figured out, because I get no credit for this. I just walked into it. But by the time I was deployed in April of last year, it was already common knowledge that putting people with COVID on the ventilator was a bad thing, that things tended to go south, but that you could actually improve oxygenation with repositioning. So that was routine. And many people who would have been put on ventilators just the week before, by the time I went to the Bronx, were not being put on ventilators, just they were being repositioned, and we watched their oxygen levels improve right before our eyes. But that was much harder with somebody who was really big, because after all, I mean, they were on a gurney in the emergency department. They were kind of wedged in there, and it was harder for them to move, and it was harder for the staff to turn them. So they were being turned less often and less effectively. So there was a direct mechanical disadvantage. It wasn't just metabolic. So, you know, the mechanisms of this were on display when I was there rendering care. And I made a very modest contribution to the front lines, and I was glad to do it. I just felt like I should do my part. So, you know, informed by all of this, we did another paper where we estimated that more than 40% of all hospitalizations for COVID in the US could have been prevented if we had simply addressed these modifiable conditions we've long known how to fix. But then we were done one better. This is again, Dariush Mozaffarian is the senior author, and others in this paper in the Journal of the American Heart Association. So here they looked at a wider array of cardiometabolic conditions and estimated that more than 60% of the hospitalizations in the US for COVID were avoidable. Not by avoiding COVID, maybe we could have done that better too, that's another topic, but by fixing cardiometabolic issues related to diet and lifestyle. And again, just to remind you where we are in the talk, I'm simply making clear what diet could do, how critically important it is. And I am making the acute case for chronic health. Now, we usually, in my field, preventive medicine, lifestyle medicine, you know, we're talking about take good care of yourself now and you'll avoid bad things in the future. Yeah, but during a pandemic, the future is next week. You know, we're not just talking about delayed gratification. Oops, sorry, bit of mayhem in the background. We're not just talking about avoid, you know, heart disease, diabetes in the future. We're talking about the immediate protection conferred by better cardiometabolic health during the pandemic. So imagine if 60% of hospitalization had been avoided, that of course would have meant 60% less mortality. I mean, that's massive. That totally changes the scope of the pandemic. We had this opportunity. So I've made the case in my own writing that two pandemics are actually better than one. If SARS-CoV-2 was a one-size-fits-all scourge, in other words, no matter what your health was, you're equally likely to get really sick and die, you know, then all we could do is stay away from the virus and wait for the vaccine. But if that's not true, and it's not true, we also have the opportunity to address these other pandemics, make ourselves healthier, which, by the way, is the gift that keeps on giving, because that will be advantageous long after SARS-CoV-2, you know, it has receded into epidemiologic background, but it will protect us acutely as well. So two pandemics create an opportunity that one does not, because fixing one is the best defense against the other. I created this color-coded grid early on. Red is bad, that's high risk. So if you're elderly and chronically ill, you're at very high risk of bad outcomes. As you move from red to yellow to green, things improve. If you're young and healthy, you're at very low risk. But the white arrows are what interest me most as a preventive medicine, lifestyle medicine specialist. Those are the opportunities we had and arguably still have to take people from higher risk tiers into lower risk tiers. And this is what health promotion, disease prevention, programming could do. All right, well, that'll do the acute and chronic case for how powerful diet is, how important diet is, what diet can do. What I haven't answered yet is what diet can do all of that. And of course, many of you have very strong opinions on this topic. I'm not going to say anything that's going to shock you. So I suspect here we fall into the space where you're just going to nod your heads and say, yeah, we already knew that. But let's start with these pithy 7 words from Michael Pollan, so well known, and you know, probably the most famous adage about eating well in the modern era: eat food, not too much, mostly plants. And what Pollan means by food is real food, not hyper-processed glow-in-the-dark Frankenfood, so food direct from nature. The not too much is certainly important in a world awash in obesity, but you don't really need to focus on that, because if you eat real food, the not too much takes care of itself. And I'll come back to that in a little while when I talk about another Michael Moss. And mostly plants, because pollen is not ideological on this. It's clear that all good diets are plant predominant. This is an audience that's likely to favor plant exclusive, and plant exclusive is a variant on the theme of plant predominant. So this may be more of a rising tide that can lift all boats, but it certainly does not in any way preclude being plant exclusive. But all good diets are plant predominant diets, and most modern diets are animal food predominant, and that means they're broken and need to be fixed. And Pollen basically got it right. Every time I've looked at this issue, and I've spent a career looking at this issue, I've reached exactly that same conclusion. Did a review article for Annual Reviews of Public Health in 2014. Can we say what diet is best for health? Looked at an extensive span in the literature, and the theme of feeding Homo sapiens well is a diet of real food, and mostly, if not only, minimally processed vegetables, fruits, whole grains, beans, lentils, nuts, seeds, and plain water when thirsty. And the simple fact is that if you get that right, if your diet really is predominantly vegetables, fruits, whole grains, beans, lentils, nuts, and seeds, and plain water for thirst, you can't go too far wrong, because whatever else you do is a very small contributor to your diet. If you don't get that right, whatever else you do is unlikely to make much difference, because the fundamentals of your dietary pattern are off the theme that's good for our kind of animal. And I might as well throw that into the mix again. I mentioned it before. We are a kind of animal. We tend to forget that. There's sort of a Homo sapien arrogance that makes us talk about nature and us as if we're separate things. Of course, we're not separate things. We are a kind of animal. And think for a minute about the fact that every other kind of animal has a way that it ought to eat. Right? So, we cannot expect lions to eat grass. Lions need to eat wildebeest. They are obligate carnivores. Wildebeest need to eat grass. If in a zoo you gave grass to the lions and meat to the wildebeest, they would both die. So how an animal needs to eat, what it's adapted to eat, is always relevant. And by the way, usually zookeepers do not run randomized controlled trials. They don't try the lions on grass and then say, no, that didn't work well, let's try something else. They feed animals in accord with their obvious adaptations and native requirements. It's very useful when we think about ourselves to think about the kind of animal we are. If you can join what we know from modern science with what we know about every other species, the fact that its anatomy, its physiology tell you a lot about how it needs to eat, the answer is perfectly clear. And there really should be much less debate than we see on display. I have devoted countless hours and years to this issue, and as kindly mentioned during the introduction, I've written 19 books to date, many of them textbooks, including Nutrition and Clinical Practice. We're just wrapping up the 4th edition now. We've turned in 52 chapters across an expanse of 750 pages and 10,000 citations. So this is a textbook on nutrition for health professionals, and we just updated it. And once again, the conclusion is that for human health, diets need to be based on real food, not frankenfood, and plant predominant. And that reverberates through all of my other writing, including the books available in the bookstore here, The Truth About Food. And by the way, all proceeds from that one go to support the True Health Initiative, a 501c3. And then the book I was recently privileged to do with Mark Bittman, How to Eat. And of course, I have the best of company, along with many of the other speakers at this conference. A who's who in nutrition has weighed in on this topic. What do we know about optimal dietary patterns for every aspect of human health? From Dariush Mozaffarian to Jim Mann to Frank Hugh, who's now chair of nutrition at Harvard, and many, many others. And the conclusions are incredibly consistent and clear. And they reverberate around the world. Our dietary guidelines in the US are not really all that unique. And leaving aside the flaws in the dietary guidelines, and yes, there are significant flaws, by all means, bring that up in the Q&A. We can get back into it. My point here is simply that the fundamentals, encouraging people to eat more fruits and vegetables and whole grains rather than refined grains, and cut back on meat, which is prominent in other dietary guidelines, not as prominent as it should be in the US, but that's in dietary guidelines all around the world. And what makes this important is these are very diverse cultures, but we are all the same kind of animal. We're one great big species. We're a big human family. It makes sense that yes, you can apply an ethnic or cultural overlay and eat the way you want to eat, but the fundamentals are the fundamentals. They're rooted in biology, not culture. They don't change. And these dietary guidelines in very diverse cultures reflect that. And I very much like the example of the blue zones. I trust you're all very familiar with the blue zones, those 5 places around the world, identified for us by National Geographic fellow Dan Buettner, where people most routinely live to be 100 and don't get chronic disease. In Ikaria, Greece, Sardinia, Italy, Okinawa, Japan, Loma Linda, California, and the Nicoya Peninsula in Costa Rica. And in the world's blue zones, we could take a look at dietary patterns on a spectrum from animal food predominant to plant food predominant, AFP to PFP, and from ultra-processed food predominant to real food predominant, UFP to RFP. And interesting to note that the blue zones all cluster on the right side of the spectrum. They all eat real food, and they all have plant food predominant diets. Now, they're not all vegan. There are quite a few vegans in Loma Linda. There are maybe some in Okinawa, but in Okinawa, they eat a little bit of fish and seafood. In Costa Rica, they have an omnivorous diet. They eat mostly wild meat. They do some hunting. It's very limited, but it's not a plant food exclusive diet. The 2 Mediterranean countries involved, Greece and Italy, those diets are not plant food exclusive either. But the thing that makes them alike is the plant food predominance. So they differ what's included, whether there's dairy or not. There's some dairy, obviously, in the Mediterranean diets. There's none in the Okinawan diet. So, if you want to look at these diets through the lens that clarifies, okay, what matters? If all these populations live to be 100, if all of them have remarkably low rates of chronic disease, it's what their diets have in common that's the active ingredient. And the active ingredient is vegetables, fruits, whole grains, beans, lentils, nuts, and seeds every time. That evidence matters. But there's a whole different argument to be had here. And that is, what about the planet? So you've heard me say up until now that if we're talking just about the epidemiologic evidence related directly to human health, we need to stay on a basic theme of eating. But I don't think that's the only lens we should be looking through. Personally, I think we need to be looking through 3 lenses. What does food and diet do directly to our health? Very important. And that generates a pretty clearly defined answer. What does our diet mean for how we treat our fellow creatures? You heard my dogs bark in the background. I have 2 dogs. I have a horse. I was fortunate to have some time to ride earlier today. They're my friends. I love them. Well, animals just like them, just as sentient, just as sensitive, just as intelligent, are food routinely. And not just food, because, if you hunt, an animal can be your food. But they're tortured for a lifetime before they become food. That's got to matter. I don't think anyone with a conscience should be okay with cruelty, gratuitous cruelty on the menu. And factory farming of animals engenders gratuitous cruelty at a horrific scale. I look through that lens. I can't help but look through that lens. And my eyes were first opened to this space by John Robbins when I read The Food Revolution. You could probably all point to a source that raised our consciousness. But once you know, this is something you can't unknow, and I don't think any decent person can pretend it doesn't matter. And then there's the third issue, and that's what was featured in this recent article in The Atlantic. Our diets are cooking the planet, and the single best thing we can do to preserve biodiversity, stop raising the Amazon and the rainforest in Borneo, and on it goes, is stop eating meat, in particular beef. Beef is the reason that places like this, beautiful places, this is in the Amazon basin, are transformed into this so that we clear the way to do this, graze cattle, so that we can make more hamburgers and feed the world's appetite for beef. So, it's all too easy to blame Brazil's crazy president for the fact that the Amazon keeps burning. It's the global appetite for beef. If there weren't a demand, there would be no supply, and they'd leave those magnificent rainforest trees standing. They're being cut down because people are greedy, and they always pursue quick gratification and money. And so the demand is crucial. It's the global demand for beef. So as I said earlier in the talk, the privilege of being in front of you here now is that you are amplifiers. We're all amplifiers of one another when we reach one another, when we persuade one another. It is our job to convey that to people who otherwise would not have heard it. And every one of us can do that. Anytime we are inspired, we have the opportunity to pay it forward. And I ask you to do that. We must raise awareness that, look, maybe you like meat and maybe you're not worried about its effects on your health, but you've got to care about a world where there is no Amazon rainforest. And how can you not care? It's really one of the crown jewels of this magnificent planet. You don't want to be the reason that it's gone, that future generations just look back at that as a historical thing that was burned up, taken for granted. So this is the reason. It's not Bolsonaro. Yeah, he's no help, the president of Brazil. It's beef. And so when I did this interview for NPR some years ago, how bad really is red meat, I talked a bit about animal protein, saturated fat, the usual things you'll be hearing about from other speakers at this conference. And I said, I look at this through three lenses: direct effects on human health, what we know and how we know it, what it means in terms of how we treat our fellow creatures, domestic creatures, and then what it means for every natural wild thing in the world. And that is crucially important. In that context, and I don't know how all of you feel about the sort of the new age of meat-free diets, but it's sort of being taken over by high tech, right? And we're going to have more and more of these offerings, but just to single out the ones that are best known, we have Beyond and we have Impossible, so plant-based meat alternatives. I did a piece for Medium a year or so ago, noting that these are ultra-processed foods. There's no question about that, to borrow from Carlos Montero and the Nova scale, which is a way to rate how processed foods are. These are ultra-processed. So they may not be that much better for human health. I mean, if you go from a highly processed meat to a highly processed plant alternative, it's probably a little better, but maybe it's mostly a lateral move for your health. But I don't really care, because there is no health without a planet to live on. There are no healthy people on a ruined, inhospitable planet. And I care about the health of creatures other than ourselves anyway. So if you factor all that in, and this is the ironic part of talking about plant-based meat, I have to quote Meatloaf: 2 out of 3 ain't bad. So if we look at direct human health effects, maybe better, maybe not. We really don't know yet. If we look at kinder, gentler treatment for our fellow creatures, hell yeah. And lesser impact on the planet in terms of water utilization, greenhouse gas emissions, climate change, et cetera, hell yeah, 2 out of 3 ain't bad. So I like these, not for myself. I have no interest in them. I really like to eat plants, so I don't want my fake plant burger to bleed. I'll take my wife's vegan burgers any day. By the way, you're looking for the best vegan burger recipes on the planet, go to Cuisinicity. It's Cuisine City, but with an I in the middle, Cuisinicity. This is my wife, Catherine's free recipe website. And just type into the search box, vegan burgers. And a recipe for the bun, and she has videos to show you how to make them. Easy to make. They're the best. I mean, incredible texture. But for people who actually like to eat plants, they're fantastic. For people who are not willing to eat plants, that's the beauty of Beyond, Impossible, and all the rest, because these are gateway drugs. I mean, the idea is, okay, so people who are just obligate carnivores, they refuse to, catch this train because they really like meat. They're never going to be converted because they like meat too much. Give them something that tastes like meat but isn't cruel to other creatures and isn't devastating the environment, and they'll shrug their shoulders and say, yeah, okay, feels like meat, tastes like meat, this'll do. And frankly, there are lots of people like that, who are decent and would rather not have cruelty on the menu and would rather not be the reason the Amazon's burned down, but really like to eat meat. Well, let's create a way for them to move in the right direction. And I think this technology-based advance does exactly that. So I am not a personal fan. I'm not interested. I don't need these products, but I'm a supporter, because I think the goal here is to win over people who would otherwise not be part of this movement. And for us to do what needs doing, this can't be a limited movement. This can't just be us. And let's see, how many of us are here? There are 360 of us here right now. Nice. We need 360 million, and then that's not enough. We need 3.6 billion, and then maybe that's not enough. We need everybody in on this. And so every way we can move people in the right direction is a good way. Every way we can reduce our environmental footprint, good. Every way we can be kinder and gentler to our fellow creatures, good. And then, let this be a gateway so people get used to eating plant-based burgers that bleed, and then maybe ultimately they can actually learn to love beans and lentils and not need these ultra-processed products. But let's start somewhere. You may hear from other speakers differences about this. I am very confident. I think this is eminently defensible based on anatomy, physiology, and the history of our kind, evolutionary biology. We're constitutional omnivores. But that's not an obligation of any kind. Omnivores have choices, and our choices should be informed. So it really doesn't matter if our Stone Age ancestors hunt animals and ate them. We can't be Stone Age hunters. Stone Age hunters lived in a great big empty world where all animals were wild animals, with the exception of maybe the earliest examples of domesticated wolves turned into something like dogs. But other than that, all animals were wild. They lived free. Animals ate other animals, and our kind of animal may have done that periodically too. It has nothing whatever to do with mass production of factory farmed animals. Nothing, whatever, night and day. So, if you tell me, no, I want to eat meat because, periodically I'm going to take a bow and arrow and go hunt for antelope or deer, is that good or bad for you? Well, honestly, we don't have a study to compare an optimal plant-based diet with some venison versus an optimal plant-exclusive diet. So, if someone tells you, we know for sure that it's better to have the plant-based diet without the venison, that's just preference. And I may prefer that too. I love deer. I can't imagine shooting one with anything, bow and arrow, gun. So I prefer that too. But I try very hard never to substitute my preference for the facts. The facts are things we know. The preferences are things we want. So I would rather people not hunt deer and antelope. But, honestly, we don't know. And if you're interacting with people who favor a paleo diet, you have to be prepared, to have a conversation that's based on what they know, what we know. And then, but here's why I would prefer we go a different way. But again, the simple fact is that Stone Age foragers needed enough space so that those wild animals all had a place to live. Whatever portion of the diet was made up of animal foods, and that's very much debated in the literature on paleoanthropology. It was probably much smaller than most people think. But I've done the math. I did this in a Huffington Post piece some years ago. For the modern population of Homo sapiens to live anything remotely like our Stone Age ancestors, we would need 15 times the surface area of Earth. And I mean all of Earth. I mean the oceans, the polar ice caps, the Sahara Desert. It's absurd. So this conversation is just silly. All that we need to know from our Stone Age experiences, we are omnivores, we have choices, we should make good ones. And the best choice we can make is a beautiful grand confluence where we improve diet quality for the sake of our health and the health of people we love, and for every other creature on the planet and the planet itself. And we are very fortunate, because among the things we know is that objective measures of diet quality and measures of environmental impact move together. That need not have been the case. If we were lions and had to eat meat because we were not adapted to eat anything else, and the world was being ruined from meat consumption, we'd have a real dilemma. We can either eat the way that our bodies need, or we can take care of our planet, but we can't do both. We can do both. We need plant-predominant diets. We thrive on plant-exclusive diets, and the more we move in that direction, the better it is for all creatures, great and small, and this beautiful planet. We're fortunate. We have the opportunity for this grand confluence. That's the right choice. And this is a message that's made very clear in the seminal Eat Lancet Commission on Food, Planet, and Health. This report's available for you online. So when you refer back to these slides, this is a reference you may want to follow up on. And when I think about a grand confluence, I am a physician. I'm thinking about adding years to lives, life to years. I care about people, but I want there to be an Amazon for my children and grandchildren and their grandchildren. It is a gem of the planet. I want there to be a rainforest in Borneo for orangutans to climb. I want cruelty to animals as smart and sensitive as the family dog to stop. And I want there to be aquifers preserved so that thirsty people can drink. I want these things. They matter. And this is what the stakes are when we talk about diet. So that's part 1 and 2. It's how important diet is, what diet can do, and what diet can do it. But how do we know all this? How do we know what we know? You will hear, in particular, from many with impressive credentials who attack nutrition. And I'm sure you've encountered this before, right? On the morning shows. And you somewhere you've come across the argument that nobody knows anything about nutrition. They don't know what they're talking about. And no, it's not settled. Maybe you've run into people, I certainly do all the time, who argue, no, it's not true, and meat is good for us. Well, I disagree. And usually when you encounter those arguments, it's people who are thrashing you over the head with an idea that there's just one way to know something. And usually that notion is the randomized controlled trial. And so if you've not done a randomized controlled trial to prove that, say, a vegan diet is better than a mixed diet over an 80-year span, a whole lifetime, if you haven't randomly assigned people to be vegan or Mediterranean and followed them for 100 years, then you don't know. I completely disagree. Partly I disagree because of the three lenses I've been talking about. What does diet do to us? What does it do to our fellow creatures? What does it do to the planet and the environment? But I also disagree because as a scientist who has conducted and published dozens of randomized controlled trials, has conducted and published meta-analyses, systematic reviews, even invented some methods of evidence synthesis that have caught on around the world, I believe in the power of sense. As a scientist, I'm here to tell you I believe in the power of sense. In fact, I would go so far as to say science has the force of a freight train to drive us toward truths that are otherwise hard to reach, but sense must lay the tracks. And if you board that train without tracks, you're going to have a train wreck. Science is the best means we have ever devised to answer hard questions. Sense is the best means we have ever devised to ask sensible questions in the first place. And if you don't ask sensible questions, there are no good answers. A lot of what we know is just sense and experience. So I tossed an apple in the air at a debate I was having about all of these things and said, as it left my hand, it's going to fall back down. I know that. That's knowledge. I know it. Now, somebody wants to tell me that I can't know it because there's never been a randomized controlled trial to examine that issue. Go ahead, make your case. But I know this apple's going to fall back down. And of course, it did. Now, if you do this in outer space, it's a different story. But down here, you toss an apple in the air, it will fall back down. We know it. Because at a certain level, correlation is causation. Maybe you've all heard that aphorism, correlation is not causation. Yeah, it is. If every apple ever tossed in the air falls back down, that's because it's causation. Toss an apple, it will fall. We, of course, know that gravity is involved, but even if we didn't know, we just know what happens. We know it. We know that it's better to put out a campfire with water than gasoline. I have raised 5 children to adulthood. I was very confident that it made sense to advise them not to run with scissors. I have never read a meta-analysis on that topic. And I have always looked both ways before crossing a street, never seen an RCT on that topic either. Sense, my friends, it doesn't get the respect it deserves. The only problem with common sense is that it's not nearly common enough, but it matters. And science cannot function without it. Do not let people talk you out of the salience of sense in how humans know what matters. Most of what we know that gets us through the day has nothing to do with an RCT or meta-analysis and everything to do with pattern consistency, observation, and sense. However, we also have a vast amount of science. And to make full use of that science, we have to synthesize it appropriately. And what that means in nutrition is no, do not hold your breath and wait for there to be a 100-year-long randomized trial where pregnant women are randomly assigned to keto and paleo and Mediterranean and flexitarian and vegetarian and vegan, and maybe they're all matched for some measure of quality. And then when the women give birth, the babies become the participants in the study, and they're all followed for 100 years to see who lives the longest and has the least chronic disease. Don't hold your breath waiting for that trial. We do need RCTs. They're very useful. They answer questions in a particular way, but they're just part of a mix. And what we really need is hybrid vigor. The things we can learn from mechanistic studies, the things we can learn from cell culture, the things we can learn from randomized controlled trials, the things we can learn from observational epidemiology and ethnography, looking at whole populations over the span of generations like the blue zones. So colleagues and I, including Walter Willett at Harvard and others, worked for a couple of years on this issue and published this paper recommending that we synthesize evidence the right way if we want to answer questions that matter in lifestyle medicine. questions that pertain to years in life and life in years. So for any scientists in the audience, I commend to you Hierarchies of Evidence Applied to Lifestyle Medicine in BMC Medical Research Methodology. The rest of you will not want to go down that rabbit hole. Just take my word for it. All right, so if we know what diet can do, we know what diet can do it, and we even know how we know what we know, why the heck aren't we just getting it done? Why do you have to keep coming to this conference every year to hear the real truth about health? Why isn't it just normal in our culture, right? I mean, in the blue zones, they don't have conferences like this. They don't need it. They're living it. It's every day. It's not once a year. They just do this. They eat well. They're physically active. They're not smoking. They get enough sleep. They're not stressed out. They have strong social connections, feet, forks, fingers, sleep, stress, and love. They're firing on all cylinders. They don't attend conferences to hear about it. They just do it. Why aren't we? Because there's stuff in the way, powerful stuff in the way, and we need to be particularly well informed to be empowered to deal with these obstacles. One is fools and fanatics. Bertrand Russell famously said the whole thing wrong with the world is that fools and fanatics are always so sure and wiser people so full of doubts. I would add a third category, hucksters. Hucksters are probably the worst. So fools are people who just don't know what's true and get it wrong and then propound silly ideas. Fanatics have toppled into their own vat of Kool-Aid and can't see anything else. Hucksters actually know that what they're selling is a false promise. And they don't care. That really bothers me. So there's all of this in the mix. All of this contaminates the common knowledge about diet. And I really hate this trend. I've just called out one example of the kind of book I really hate. So in this book, The Plant Paradox, the thesis is espoused that plants contain lectins, this protein complex, and theoretically, lectins could be harmful for human health. Therefore, don't eat beans, don't eat lentils, don't eat whole grains. Well, it's absurd. There is oxygen in the atmosphere of this planet, and there is theoretical evidence, and more than theoretical evidence, that oxygen can be toxic to people. That's what oxidation is all about. And so what? Stop breathing, hold your breath, wait for a better alternative. We know that people need to breathe to live. And if you stop breathing, you die. We know that. So if there's the potential toxicity for something in the air, that's not a reason to give up air. It just means the net effect of air matters more than whatever else may be in air, including oxygen. Similarly, if we know that people who eat more beans and lentils live longer and have less chronic disease, how can it possibly matter that, wait a minute, there's something in beans and lentils that could make people live less long and have more chronic disease, so stop eating them? Yeah, but wait, we already know what eating them does to health. It improves it. Nonsense. Absolute nonsense. To say nothing of the fact that if you dig into the literature on lectins, you actually find for every paper that suggests they may be harmful, 2 or 3 papers that suggest they may be beneficial, but it just doesn't matter. And by the way, they're inactivated by cooking, and people do not tend to eat raw beans and lentils. We're talking about hard beans, not green beans, which are not a source of lectins particularly. Anyway, nonsense. I don't presume to say whether this represents folly, fanaticism, or hucksterism, but I think it's at least one of those, and there are many other books that do much the same. We're also up against the din of discord. There's massive apparent disagreement among experts, certainly in the general public. We're a very polarized society on every topic, but nutrition's also in the mix. And so, we wind up even getting discord on seemingly settled topics like processed meat consumption. So about 1.5 years ago, there was a whole batch of papers in the Annals of Internal Medicine, which looked at meat and processed meat intake and disease and death. Basically, all these papers found that if you ate more meat and processed meat, you had more disease and more death. But sadly, the journal decided to offer its rarefied space, not just to all these papers from the same authors, but to their version of guidelines. They presumed to say they were offering guidelines. And they basically said, well, we analyzed the strength of this evidence using our particular method, and we've concluded it's not all that strong. So go ahead and keep eating all the processed meat you're eating now. That's absurd. I mean, it was at odds with their own findings. It's also a violation of medical ethics. First, do no harm. In public health, we say the precautionary principle. If we're not sure what the best thing to do is, but we're pretty clear stuff's on fire over here and that's a risky place to go, we're going to recommend you go this way, go away from the danger. These so-called guidelines directed the public to go toward the apparent danger, and not just the danger we knew about before, but the danger these authors revealed and evinced in their own work. Why did the journal publish this? Well, I guess because they're competing for eyeballs, and they knew this would be very provocative. But it's a disgrace, and it propagates the notion that even settled matters, like the harmful effects of processed meat, are unsettled. That's very unfortunate. But again, I'm telling you what we're up against, why we haven't already acted on what we know. We are also up against the military-industrial establishment. In any status quo, whoever is profiting from the status quo is rich right now. Rich means powerful. And if you're rich and powerful because of the way things are right now, you're not going to want the way things are right now to change. I tell this story at great length in The Truth About Food. This is a 200,000 word book. It's everything I know and how I know it. Now, the truth about food could be just 7 words, and they wouldn't even be mine. They'd be Michael Pollan's, right? Eat food, not too much, mostly plants. The other 199,993 words are all about why it's so hard to turn that simple knowledge into routine action. And so in this book, I talk at length about the fact that big food profits from pseudo-confusion about diet, is able to sell us, if you will, lipstick on a pig, basically some new kind of junk food that's gluten-free or lectin-free or whatever the craze du jour happens to be. And so big food basically laughs about, chronic disease and epidemic obesity all the way to the bank. And Big Pharma does the same, because they wind up selling us all kinds of drugs to treat diseases we never needed to get in the first place. So there's big food, there's big pharma, there's big media, there's big publishing. There are a lot of really powerful entities that are making a killing off of killing us. They don't want it to change. So you've got to change it. You've got to be the change you want to see in the world. You've got to be the tip of the spear. You've got to pay it forward. We have to be the leading edge of a cultural revolution. I also hate the fact that we're such a polarized society, whether it's about the pandemic or vaccines or climate change or nutrition, because whenever dogma is barking, we have a really hard time hearing one another. So timely that my dogs, not dogma, bark during this talk, but you'll hear no dogma from me. Dogma is when you say it's my way or the highway. What I believe or what I prefer is the only right way. You'll never hear that from me. I'm very interested in the confluence of science, sense, and expert consensus. I will absolutely tell you my personal preferences, but I will try very hard not to conflate my personal preferences with my knowledge. What I know based on facts is not negotiable. My opinion is just an opinion. I'll tell you why. I may be able to defend it, but when dogma barks, whether it's your dogma or my dogma, we'll have a hard time hearing one another, and we don't learn much when we can't listen. We never learn anything when the only opinion we're willing to hear is the one we already own. We've got to do a better job of listening to one another and reflecting. And maybe we'll disagree, but we can do that with civility and respect. Less dogma. There should be no dogma on the menu. And then I told you a while ago, while talking about Michael Pollan, I would also talk about Michael Moss. And one of the things we're up against is what I call the Moss effect. I don't know that Michael would thank me for that, but Michael Moss is a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative journalist, wrote Salt, Sugar, Fat. His latest book is recently out, Hooked. He wrote this New York Times Magazine cover story, The Extraordinary Science of Addictive Junk Food. And this tells the tale, basically, of the fact that none of this is accidental. All the big food companies hire teams of scientists to help them design foods people can't stop eating till their arms get tired from lifting them to their mouths. They play around with the texture, they play around with flavors, they do everything to maximally stimulate the appetite center in the hypothalamus. And how do they know they're maximally stimulating the human appetite center in the ventromedial hypothalamus? They use functional MRI scanners. So they actually study brain activity in response to various food ingredients, and then use the formulas that light the hypothalamus up like a Christmas tree. And then you and everybody else is supposed to practice restraint and portion control. It's absurd. The food supply is booby-trapped, literally booby-trapped. Now, you can avoid that by eating foods that nobody's mucked around with. If you eat foods direct from nature, foods with an ingredient list of one word, like blueberries, nobody's mucked around with those. And so I told you when I presented Michael Pollan's 7 words, eat food, not too much, mostly plants, the middle portion, not too much, takes care of itself. And this is how. If you go from highly processed foods that have been manipulated to maximize the calories it takes to feel full, to unprocessed foods, you minimize the calories it takes to feel full. It's one of the many virtues of unprocessed or minimally processed foods. And so you actually fill up on fewer calories. And if you fill up to satisfaction, you stop eating. And if you can do that before you've overeaten calories, weight control can occur without being hungry all the time. And that's the formula. That's a formula I've shared with patients for 30 years. It's the formula I practice myself. I weigh pretty much what I weighed when I graduated high school and have fluctuated minimally in all the years since. And it's not because I don't gain weight easily. I do, but I eat real food and I eat plants and they fill me up to satisfaction, and I eat as much as I want and I stop when I'm full and I don't count calories, and it's all good. And I definitely recommend that over counting calories or, trying to eat less than you want every day for the rest of your life, because that tends to be what we call a diet. It lasts about 6 weeks and then people fall off the wagon. But if you eat a diet of wholesome foods, there is no wagon to fall off of. It's just a way of living. It works forever. All right, so those are some of the challenges we face. How do we overcome them? What are our assets? Well, we have good assets. In addition to the science we have and the sense we have, we do have the solace of accord. We have a global expert consensus. So we can meet the challenge of discord with the solace of accord. And I know this because I've addressed it directly at many points along the way in my career. In 2015, I was privileged to co-chair with Walter Willett this conference in Boston, Old Ways Finding Common Ground. So Old Ways was our sponsor. We brought feuding nutrition experts from all around the world, literally, who had very different perspectives. So, you may not like this, but we brought experts who favored eating dairy. We brought in experts who favored eating meat or paleo. We gave everybody the opportunity to present their arguments to the audience. And then in between sessions, we worked together behind the scenes to find our common ground. And we did. And we published it. And you can Google Old Ways Common Ground. And what you'll see is what everybody agreed on, whatever their point of view is, that for the sake of human health and animal health and planetary health, everybody needs a diet of less processed food, and it needs to be plant predominant. And even the paleo experts agreed, and whatever position people came from. So, you may be bothered by the fact that there wasn't 100% agreement, but I would argue that 85, 90% agreement, that's pretty damn good. If we could just act on that, it would do a world of good. And I mean, save lives, add years to lives, add life to years, save our fellow creatures, stabilize the climate, preserve our aquifers, save the Amazon, a world of good if we were just getting it 90% right at the scale of all humanity. So we shouldn't make perfect the enemy of the good. This is a really good consensus statement. Check it out. So just Google Old Ways Common Ground. It's all there for you. And then at an even grander scale, my nonprofit, the True Health Initiative, we have brought together roughly 500 leading experts, many of the speakers at this conference among them, from 46 countries at last count, and across a great diversity of perspective, again, from paleo to vegan, everything in between, to say we agree. We agree about the fundamentals that are most important to advancing human health on a sustainably vital planet. Please visit us, truehealthinitiative.org. Please join us. Please support us. We would very much welcome you. In unity, there is strength. And then we need to think about making it easier to get there from here for both individuals and the body politic. And again, just to remind you, I'm talking about the things we have or need to get around the obstacles in our way if we're going to turn knowledge into power. I've long talked about skill power. We talk a lot about willpower. You almost never hear about its neglected half-sibling, skill power. But healthy people have skills. You guys probably all have skills. People who come to health conferences routinely, you've got skills. You learn a lot. You empower yourselves with knowledge, information. You have skills. Everything important requires skills. It took skills to learn the alphabet. We acquired that skill. It was painful in kindergarten, and we got over it, and it's been useful ever since, right? Most of us learned how to ride a bike. That was painful. We skinned our knees any number of times, but then useful for the rest of our lives. Healthy living takes skills. Those skills can be taught to everybody. And I've equated obesity and chronic disease in a culture that's awash in hyper-processed, hyper-palatable calories and labor-saving technology to drowning. It's like drowning in calories and technology. And so what do we do about drowning? We don't wait for people to drown to resuscitate them. We teach kids to swim. We put fences around pools. We put lifeguards at beaches. We put up a sign that says, don't go in the water today, there's a riptide. All those same things should be done in our society with regard to obesity and chronic disease. But for now, I'm emphasizing the importance of teaching everybody to swim, skill power. That ought to be done. However, I do believe it's unfair to leave this burden with the individual. Remember that in the blue zones, nobody's working hard. They eat well because it's normal to eat well. They're not trying. They don't have more willpower than we do. They may not even have more skill power than we do. Their culture has more skill power for healthy living, but the individuals don't. They just eat the way everybody eats. And sadly, the blue zones may go away as they become victims of our effective exporting of McDonald's and Coca-Cola. But for now, they benefit because their culture gets it right. The body politic does the right thing. And so everybody doesn't need to work quite so hard to take care of themselves. And that's what we want. And that requires a cultural revolution. We have to open everybody's eyes to the incredible value proposition of getting diet and lifestyle right, adding years to lives, adding life to years, eliminating 80% of chronic disease and premature death, and stabilizing and saving this magnificent planet we all call home. We need a revolution. And anybody listening to this message is in the vanguard of it. And then finally, I just want to briefly tell you, I think this is a critical asset in terms of getting past the obstacles we encounter, but this is also what I do now. So I was an academic physician most of my career. I was at Yale in one capacity or another for 30 years. I left that to run my own company. And I left to run my own company because I invented something really important that deserved to see daylight. There's an expression from the world of business: we manage what we measure. It's equally relevant in medicine. What matters most we call vital signs. And of course, they're measured routinely. We routinely measure blood pressure and heart rate. You've all had that done. It's impossible not to have that done if you encounter the system. If you go to the emergency room, every time you're in a clinical setting, your blood pressure gets taken. It's a vital sign. Your temperature gets taken. Vital sign. Well, if we only manage what we measure, and we need to measure what matters, then we sure as heck need to measure diet, because it matters most. That's where this talk began. Diet is the single leading predictor variable for all-cause mortality and total chronic disease. Well, it's a vital sign then. You just tell it's vital. It's vital to every aspect of health. And by the way, not just human health, but planetary health. It's vital beyond the extent even of those vital signs we already measure. When Mozaffarian and Glickman wrote this op-ed in the New York Times in August of 2019, first they highlighted the problem. Our food is indeed killing too many of us. They went on to enumerate the remedy, and the first thing they mentioned was nutrition should be captured in everybody's electronic health record. This ought to be treated essentially as a vital sign. So this was an opinion in the New York Times, but it's evolved into something else, because just a few months ago, the American College of Cardiology published a position statement in their flagship journal, Circulation, saying the same. Diet is so important in cardiovascular medicine. It is now crucial to capture it in every clinical encounter. If only we had a tool that made that possible, because the tools that we have had to date don't. They take too long. They're too hard. They rely on memory, which is faulty. Well, I knew this before it became the position statement of the American College of Cardiology. If we want to manage diet, we need to measure diet routinely. Everybody should know what their diet is. They should know their diet type. They should know their diet quality, the same way they know their blood pressure. It's that important. So for the better part of 5 years, I had been working with a team of elite scientists. I imagine you recognize some of these people. Walter Willett was chair of nutrition at Harvard before Frank Hugh. David Jenkins invented the glycemic index. Christopher Gardner at Stanford. Linda Snetzlar is currently editor-in-chief of the Journal of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, and on it goes. An incredible team. We worked for 5 years, and we built an entirely new way to assess diet. It's called Diet Quality Photo Navigation. The tool is called Diet ID, and it works like this. Which picture of balloons is in focus, right? If anybody's ever been to the eye doctor, you obviously know that I have. That's how you get a corrective lens. You don't fill out a lengthy questionnaire and try to remember how you think you saw at different times of day, in different places, in different kinds of light, when you were tired, not tired. That would be a train wreck. Now, you look at 2 images and say, the bottom one is more in focus, and then you get 2 more images and they say, how about now? You've all played this game, I trust. The device, by the way, is called a phoropter. So the phoropter shows you 2 images at a time. one more in focus than the other. Your job is simply to say which one's more in focus. If you do that enough times, in about 30 seconds, they have an exact match for your eyes in diopters. And anybody wearing glasses is a beneficiary of that. We've done that for diet. We've mapped the diets of the United States and this part of the world. We've mapped them along an x-axis in terms of operationally defined diet type. We've mapped them on the y-axis in terms of objectively measured diet quality using something called the Healthy Eating Index 2015. We have 10 tiers of quality for every kind of diet. And by the way, the high quality diets, no matter what kind of diet it is, they're more alike than different. They are real food, mostly plants, but they're not all exclusively plants because not everybody in the real world eats that way. But we created images to represent every cell in that map. We started out with a 3-day meal plan representing that type of diet at that quality level and turned that into an image. And then we invented a technique called dietary fingerprinting to produce images small enough so that we could show them on a smartphone screen. So a lot of science behind the scenes. We use the Mifflin-St. Jeor equation for any dietitians in the group to actually measure energy intake and right size the diet. We use NDSR software package to generate a nutrient database. And in 60 seconds, we can tell you what your diet type is, your diet quality, objectively measured, estimate intake of 150 nutrients, tell you about your intake of different servings of all the different food groups as well. But all you have to do to get there from here is look at 2 images at a time and say, which of these looks more like stuff you eat, A or B? And if you tell us you don't eat meat, then you don't see any images with meat in it to begin with. So we ask a couple of screener questions. They take 5 or 10 seconds. So we drop you into the right part of our map, and then we right size the diet. We get it as close a fit as we can. It's easy, it's fun, it takes about 60 seconds, whereas a food frequency questionnaire takes 90 minutes, a multi-day food diary takes multiple days. And we have every kind of diet under the sun. We even have a lot of ethnic diets, and that's really important because if we want to help people eat better, telling people who have a Latin diet, give that up and eat this way isn't going to work. People have a South Asian diet. But you can optimize diets within an ethnic context, and what we've built allows for that. For any clinicians in the group, we're a B2B company, so we're not selling this to individuals. We're not a consumer app. But for the clinician, we have this comprehensive dashboard of information made available. So again, dietitians or clinicians in the mix, this may be of interest. We have validated this against the semi-quantitative food frequency questionnaire, 1 paper published, and an outside group validated us against a 24-hour recall, another paper published, and we've deployed into more than 6 ongoing NIH-funded studies around the country. This works as intended. There's a lot more to this story, but I don't want to belabor it. Learn more at dietid.com. Our mission is to make diet the vital sign it deserves to be. We manage what we measure. Diet is the most important measure of health in the modern world. It ought to be measured in everybody. And we have the means to do that, and we're on a mission to make it so. So I will wrap up there. The view decides the lens. And when we talk about the outsized influence of diet on all things that matter, I think we need 3 lenses. And if we apply all 3 lenses, the truth about food is perfectly clear and in focus and incontrovertible. One lens is what are the direct effects of dietary intake patterns on human health? We know a lot about that. But sometimes people will take what we know, append what they prefer or believe, and act like it's all one thing. I won't do that. And I will tell you that we definitely know that diets of real food, plant predominant, are the best. Beyond that, it's a matter of preference. But where does that preference come from? The other 2 lenses. It's really important not to have cruelty on the menu. It just is for anybody with a conscience. And it's absolutely crucial that we eat in a way that sustains the vitality of this planet. As you've heard, there is no planet B. There are no healthy people on a ruined, inhospitable planet. And our dietary intake patterns at scale have massive implications for the planet. If you look at diet through 3 lenses, as I think we should, it's an incontrovertible argument for eating lots of vegetables, fruits, whole grains, beans, lentils, nuts, and seeds, and drinking plain water when thirsty, and doing very little of anything else, if not avoiding it outright. And again, we're very fortunate that everything that matters most about diet for one of these considerations lines up well against the other. So there have been multiple papers looking at shifts in environmental impact, and diet quality for human health. I showed you one earlier. Here's another one, multiple health and environmental impacts of foods. They move together. And when you get into the body of a paper like this, things get pretty dense pretty fast. But essentially, if you look at those top charts, look at the headers at the top: mortality, coronary disease, and the green are all the foods that have a favorable effect: whole grains, fruits, vegetables, nuts, legumes, potatoes, and then everything starts to go south after that. If you look at B, the bottom set of charts, and look across the top, these are harmful effects on the environment. So adding acid to the environment, ruining soil, greenhouse gas emissions, using up land, depleting water. It's exactly the same list in green: whole grains, fruits, vegetables, nuts, legumes, starchy vegetables, tubers. Wow, what a clear endorsement of the idea that we should be basing our diets on unprocessed plant foods. And not just for one reason, but for three. And here it is plotted, where you see risk of mortality along the bottom and the environmental impact along the side. And again, what's highlighted in green is the foods that have a favorable influence on both. And you do see that there's a little bit of splay here, because refined grains are still good for the environment, but they're not as good for human health, right? So there's a little bit of wiggle room to debate, but by and large, eat plants and eat them in a minimally processed form. Better for you, better for the planet. We know this. The basic care and feeding of Homo sapiens is not a mystery. It's not what we don't know about diet that most threatens our health. It's the constant wild misrepresentations of what we do know. And with that, my friends, I thank you very much for your time and attention. I will stop sharing my slides and my screen, and I will be happy to take questions in the time remaining. However that works, and one of the moderators will tell me, because I doubt I'll be able to plow through everything that was dropped into the chat.
Thank you, Dr. Katz. This is Ben from The Real Truth About Health. Hello again. And,
hey, Ben.
Hey, that was obviously very wonderful and much needed for so many of us. For those of us that can see the screen, you can see Dr. David Katz's contact information there, including the truehealthinitiative.org and davidkatzmd.com. And of course, you saw his information about Diet ID there as well. Yes, we would love to have you take questions. Thank you for that, Doctor. And what we're going to do, for everybody that's not quite sure how to do this, what you do is we want you to raise your hands, and we'll select you by raised hand in the order in which they come in. And in case you don't know how to raise your hand, use your Zoom tools at the bottom of your screen. Sometimes it's at the top of your screen. There's a tab that says reactions. You go ahead and click on the reactions tab, and then in there, there's something there that says raise hand. You click that, we will see your hand raised, and we'll go ahead and ask you individually to unmute yourselves to ask a question of Dr. Katz. And so, by the way, there are some people that sometimes they don't have a reactions tab. You might be able to find that raise hand button at your participants tab. So with that, Doctor, if you're ready.
Yes, I am.
Great,
sure.
Thank you. We'll go ahead. I see the first person on our list with a raised hand is Benny F. Benny, if you would go ahead and unmute yourself, please, for Dr. David Katz. Hi, Benny.
Thank you so much. Great presentation, Doctor. And just a quick comment before my questions. I think the practical problem is most restaurants and most supermarkets everywhere sell overly cooked, overly killed, and overly chemicaled food. So it's hard to find it healthy. So my three questions are your comments on raw versus cooked, your comments on detoxing, especially colon cleansing, and you have a comment on supplements.
All right. Well, thank you for the kind words, Benny. Raw versus cooked, detoxing, and supplements. On the first topic, it depends. Just to reaffirm my position, it would be dogmatic to say one of these is always better. I'll give you a quick example. So chances are this audience, most of you have heard of lycopene. It's a carotenoid nutrient. It's what makes tomatoes red. And you may have heard that it's particularly good for the prostate. Actually, those studies didn't particularly pan out, but it's a potent antioxidant. It's a very useful nutrient. It's important whether or not it single-handedly prevents prostate cancer. Well, lycopene is a fat-soluble nutrient. And the levels available for human metabolism are much, much higher when tomatoes are cooked together with, say, olive oil, than when tomatoes are eaten raw. So, you would like to think that if one of these is always better, then it means better access to all the important nutrients. This is just one example. There are many, many others. But just to make the point that, in the case of bioavailability of lycopene, actually cooking is better. There may be some other nutrients in tomatoes that are harmed by cooking. And this is true across an expanse of foods. And then there are other issues such as the safety of food. Of course, for people who are vegan, the option of eating raw is far greater because there are much more alarming health concerns with animal foods related to bacterial transmission and so forth. But I mentioned I think the Plant Paradox is a misleading and silly book, and it's basically steering people away from all of the foods we know to be best for health. But if you're only willing to eat raw, it's going to be really hard to eat a wide variety of beans and lentils. And the simple fact is that the high concentrations of some compounds, including lectins, in raw beans and lentils makes them extremely unpleasant to digest, if not potentially toxic. It's moot because they're always eaten cooked. They're always eaten cooked in the blue zones. They've always been eaten cooked traditionally. So I would argue against dogma on that topic. Some foods are more nutritious cooked. Some foods are more nutritious raw. And we have better access to a wide variety of the foods most robustly associated with good human health outcomes if we're willing to do both. So I don't have a strong opinion that you should always do one. I have a strong opinion that you should renounce dogma. And so, I think your diet overall is likely to be far better if you allow for cooking. It's going to be very hard to eat lentils if you don't cook, and probably a bad idea to eat them raw. I think lentils are a fantastic food. And by the way, cooking is an extremely native activity. I mean, we've been doing this presumably since Homo erectus. That's when fire was first tamed. That's a couple million years. That's a very long, when you consider that all of modern civilization is only 15,000 years old, the fact that our kind of animal has been cooking for hundreds of thousands, if not millions of years, it's very native to us. So I favor a mix of the two. In terms of detoxing, I've always been of the opinion that the body is more adept at this than anything we come up with. The body is richly endowed with detox organs. Your liver is an astoundingly sophisticated detox organ. Your spleen is a detox organ. Your gastrointestinal system overall is a detox organ. Your lungs are a detox organ, and on it goes. Take good care of them, and they will take care of you. All the other arguments for different approaches to detox are usually, forgive me, more about somebody selling something. So, whether it's colonic cleanses or now, if we're talking about spiritual purification, so you're going to go on, some kind of a fast or a retreat, and it's a detox, you're basically going to get out of your life for a while so you can focus, and it's going to involve, a juice cleanse. I don't really object because, essentially what you're doing, you know how periodically when enough has gone wrong with your computer, there's only one remedy. You just have to reboot it. You don't know exactly what's wrong, but if you turn it off and turn it back on, some of that stuff gets fixed. Maybe we're a bit like that too, right? I mean, we tend to accumulate the lint of arduous living, and a detox may be an important psychological window, a departure. Conjoining that to things you do, and maybe, if you're routinely eating badly, the idea that you can reboot that by going on some sort of a fast or a cleanser, I'm okay with that too. The idea that if you eat well and take care of yourself every day, that you need to do something specific to detox yourself, or that's likely to work, generally not true. So that, at the level of the general population. If, however, you have a particular toxic exposure, lead, mercury, there are detoxes done in medicine where we use chelating agents that can soak up heavy metals, for example. That won't happen without a specific intervention. So again, this may frustrate you, but this is what you get from me because I'm committed to anti-dogma. It depends. By and large, though, the kinds of cleanses that people get into, the detoxes that people think about, I oppose. I say take good care of your vital organs. They are magnificently designed to detox the body. You take good care of them, they will take good care of you. We cannot hope to rival their capacity to detox us. So feed them well, nurture them, exercise them well, hydrate them well. They'll do the rest. And then on the issue of supplements, actually, it ties into what we do at Diet ID. I think the word is really important and neglected. The word supplement implies supplemental to something. What's the something? The something obviously is the nutrients you get from food. But how many people know that? Because diet's never assessed, hardly anyone knows what their nutrient intake level from diet is. One of our clients at Diet ID is a large nutrient supplement maker where we said, we can together personalize and make sense out of nutrient supplement recommendations. It's not just here, take everything we sell, but here are the nutrients you're getting from your diet. Here where there are gaps. Now you can fix those gaps by eating better, but in the meantime, these are the supplements that make sense for you. I think that's the way to go. With my patients over the years, I always got a history about their diet and lifestyle before offering any advice about supplements. I think some people take too few because they have gaps in their diets, and supplements can be very helpful. Many people take way too many, including nutrients that are unlikely to do them any good. So I think we can have a much more judicious approach to supplementation. I think we can personalize it in sensible ways. But across all three of your very good questions, my answer is it depends. Does everybody need supplements? Probably not. Although there may be some that, it's really hard to do without. Again, vitamin D is a good example. Vitamin D is a hormone. It's not really a nutrient. It's only become a nutrient because we're not getting enough sun exposure to manufacture it. But really, the human body is adapted to make vitamin D. And if we're not going to get it from the sun, then we need to substitute vitamin D from food. And mostly that means fortified foods. So will you get enough vitamin D from fortified foods if you're not out in the sun making enough of it? Maybe, maybe not. But vitamin D supplementation is a pretty routine thing for people who live indoors and wear clothes and are not routinely exposed to sunlight. Probably a good idea. And there are other nutrients that fall into that category. I like algae-based omega-3. And my practice, as always, patterns my preaching. I take vitamin D. During the pandemic, I added zinc, which I hadn't been taking before. I take a probiotic. I take an algae-based omega-3. Short list of supplements I think make a lot of sense. So it depends.
Great advice, Doctor, for those of us who, as Dr. Katz just so eloquently put, are accumulating the lint of arduous living. Up next, Dr. Katz, we have somebody with the initials DF. DF, if you'd go ahead and unmute yourself, please, with Dr. Katz.
Thank you for giving me a chance to ask Dr. Katz question. And Dr. Katz, I am a big fan of yours. You're one of the best presenters I've ever encountered. Thank you so much for everything you do.
So kind.
You're also a walking encyclopedia of research. I have a couple of questions to ask you. Perhaps the first one is very quick. Do we have any definitive research showing that naturally occurring trans fat in meat and dairy is bad for human health, like artificially introduced trans fat? I think I remember reading something from the Institute of Medicines at one point. Maybe the IOM is still saying that naturally occurring trans fat in animal products is actually has some health benefits, but I'm not sure whether my memory has failed me or not. So that's the first question. The second question: earlier this year, there was a research published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, I believe that's what it's called, saying that there was no significant association between unprocessed red meat and poultry intake and mortality. I know the database they use came from the Pure study, and I know that there has already been a lot of rebuttal provided by the True Health Initiative and other healthcare practitioners as well for the Pure study last year. Or maybe 2 years ago. But in any case, I wonder what your thoughts are on the one that was published earlier this year.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you. First of all, thank you for your very kind words. That they're very much appreciated. And two excellent questions. So on the topic of naturally occurring trans fat, You asked, is there definitive research showing harmful, not harmful? And in particular, you mentioned definitive science related to trans fats occurring naturally in meat and dairy. The answer is no, because there has been no, imagine, essentially, if you're talking about the isolated effect of trans fat in meat and dairy, well, then you can't have everything else in meat and dairy. You really just want to study the trans fat. So you have to isolate trans fat from meat and dairy and administer it to people, I guess, versus a placebo, kind of like a drug trial. So you'd encapsulate the naturally occurring trans fat, extract it from the meat and dairy, administer that to people versus a placebo. I've not seen that done. It's probably unethical because high doses of trans fat do tend to be harmful. The potential for beneficial effects probably refers to the literature on medium chain triglycerides. So some trans fats are of different chain length. There is some argument that medium chain triglycerides are potentially beneficial, anti-inflammatory, and so forth. And there are some trans fats in that fat class. But again, no definitive evidence one way or the other. But it's more interesting than just meat and dairy. So, again, this is an audience that is not very interested in eating meat and dairy. But some of you may be inclined, as I am, to include extra virgin olive oil in your diet. And there is trans fat at a very low level in olive oil. There's trans fat in a lot of plant foods at a very low level. There are no studies there either where you just isolate the trans fat. It's a little bit like the story with lectins. You really want to know, what is the net effect of eating this food? If the net effect of eating the food is harmful, then at that point, who really cares if an isolated nutrient is harmful or beneficial? It's a food you mostly want to avoid. If the net effect is decisively good, similarly, if this nutrient that occurs naturally in the food at a very low level is potentially harmful, there are cancer-causing compounds in broccoli, but the net effect of eating broccoli is much less cancer, not more. So, again, I think it sort of gets into the realm of what is the active ingredient. But the honest answer to your question is no, there is no definitive research on the isolated effects of these naturally occurring trans fats, which reverberate through not just meat and dairy, but many plant foods as well. But they occur at very low levels. They are structurally somewhat different than the willful industrial produced trans fat, partially hydrogenated oils, mostly in terms of the length of the carbon chains. And that does change the metabolic pathways. On the topic of red meat and the PURE study. So the PURE study, which stands for Prospective Urban and Rural Epidemiology, many of you may have heard of it. Quite frankly, with all due respect to many colleagues involved in the effort, it's a bit of a disaster. The idea behind PURE was that if we look at a massive scale across many, many different countries, dozens, if not hundreds of countries, and we're sure to include countries that are poor and rich, and we look at dietary patterns and health outcomes, we will understand better than anybody ever did before, and we will speak a more potent truth. But that's incredibly misguided. I'll give you a quick example, and then I'll come back to PURE and meat. Imagine doing a study of the health effects of swimming. And imagine that you want to know the health effects of swimming as an exercise on as big and diverse a population as possible. So you include in your study people who know how to swim and people who don't know how to swim, and you throw them all in the same pool. Well, the people who know how to swim, and the exercise is good for them. The people who don't know how to swim drown. So you conclude that there is no effect of swimming on health because it harms as many people as it helps. It's preposterous. If you know how to swim, then swimming is fantastic exercise. If you don't know how to swim, you can learn how to swim, and then swimming can be great exercise. But mixing those two populations together would be idiotic. The PURE study does that. So there are countries in the mix of the PURE study where people are protein deficient. The Horn of Africa, for example, many people in Bangladesh, other places around the world where there is overt protein malnutrition. Well, basically in a situation like that, if you can get some meat into your diet, it's going to be tremendously beneficial to your health. I mean, effectively, you've got starvation to contend with. So fixing starvation is a real good thing for people. And if you've got nothing to eat and can get something to eat, eating anything is better than nothing. So there are countries in the PURE sample where dairy and meat look good, not because they're necessarily the best choices for people, but we're talking about people who have no choices at all. And the alternative is protein deficiency and starvation. So the families and households that eat meat do better. And if you look in those countries, does eating more meat result in bad or good health outcomes? Actually looks good. You then look at affluent countries, the US, Europe, much of the world, where we can eat what we want most of the time. It's perfectly clear that eating more meat is associated with bad outcomes, very consistently, very potently. So what the Pure study has done is muddied the water and confounded the issue by acting like, because we're looking at a bigger scale, we're telling a truth that other studies have missed. Absolutely not. They have such a heterogeneous sample. They are mixing together beneficial effects in a population that's starving, harmful effects in a population prone to obesity, heart disease, and type 2 diabetes, put the two together and concluded no net effect. What all of my respected colleagues ask routinely, and my good friend at Stanford, Christopher Gardner, wrote on this very recently, commentary in the Journal of the American College of Nutrition, we must always ask instead of what. You can't just ask, is eating meat good or bad for people? You have to say instead of what. If it's instead of nothing, if you're talking about people who are starving to death and scraping by on nothing but white rice, that meat is actually good for them. And by the way, this is a reason why we want to be careful not to be too dogmatic about plant exclusive eating. Most of us who have good options can be plant exclusive. It leaves a little bit of meat available to people who have overt protein deficiency and will actually benefit from it. And I think that at a global scale, I think that redistribution would be fine. We can get into the details of that some other time, but basically there are clearly populations where concentrated protein sources, doesn't have to be meat, but it can be, do them a lot of good. You cannot mix together populations where in one X does good, in the other X does harm, put them together and say no net effect. You have to say instead of what. When meat is instead of beans or lentils, it's harmful. When eating more meat means eating less vegetables, it's harmful. And that's what it means in the US and much of the modern world. So I find the Pure study dangerous. Dangerous because it's shockingly wrong, but because of the magnitude of it, it does attract a lot of attention. And so its capacity to do harm is outsized. And it's a little surprising, too, that so many researchers have rallied around such a misguided venture. And again, the people that I respect most and work most closely with have all agreed that the study's pretty much a train wreck. It's going to continue to get attention because it's so big, but it's a big train off the tracks. That's my opinion about that. And I'm going to need to apologize. I actually have another commitment at the top of the hour. I can maybe do one more question. We're going to have to drop just a couple minutes before the clock hits 4, so I can pivot to that one.
We certainly appreciate the unmute, please.
Hi, Dr. Katz.
Hi, Steve.
Pleasure as always to hear from you. What a mensch.
Thank you.
While you were talking about the pandemic, there was a young lady, I don't know if you saw the chat, that started to ask about Geert Van der Bosch and his call to halt vaccinations, Sherry Tenpenny's that the vaccine is going to do harm, Judy Michovich's Plandemic movie. We've been inundated with this stuff for the last year. How do we do a debate? This is sort of like a religious. How do you talk to somebody who wants to believe? And when you say, look at this, they say, oh, you can't believe that because that's funded by George Soros or Bill Gates or God Almighty, or there's always an answer, and it's never to the issue.
Right.
The other question I wanted to ask you is, over the years, personally, my blood counts have always been on the low side. White blood count, red blood counts, is there a different range for plant-based folks that's a little bit lower when it comes to these things?
Okay, so
where I'm at.
Yeah, Steve, thanks.
Thank you so much.
I'm going to answer quickly, and I apologize. On the issue of vaccines, I try to confront dogma by being as reasonable as I can. I listen to people. I listen to all the arguments against. I listen to the arguments for. I look at the weight of evidence. And then I try to speak very calmly and say, I hear you. I understand why you're concerned. You don't completely trust science. You certainly don't trust politics. And science can do harm, sometimes on purpose, often inadvertently. So I completely respect your reticence. But I know what you know, and I've had training, and I have a family, and I love them, and I want to do what's safest for them, and I choose to get vaccinated, and I'm perfectly happy to tell you why if you want to listen to me. I start there, and then I say, nothing we do in medicine is completely risk-free. Crossing the street is not risk-free. It's all a matter of shopping the options, looking for the least risk, greatest potential benefit. I love nature, but frankly, nature is the source of botulinum toxin and rattlesnake venom. Sometimes you need a drug, and I've been a beneficiary of that. I had anaplasmosis from a tick bite. I was very grateful to receive intravenous tetracyclines. It probably saved my life. So, vaccines are the same. Yeah, they can go wrong. Yeah, they can do harm. But, the net effect of immunization on public health has been absolutely massive benefit. So that's how I feel about confronting the dogma issue. I don't know if I really have time to do justice to your second question. I wonder if I might be able to leave it there and not risk being late for my next appointment. I really do apologize, but I need these 2 minutes to pivot. But Steve, again, really appreciate you all. I do wish we had more time for questions, but I'm easy to find. So those of you that want to follow up with me, please do, and we can continue the dialogue.
Dr. Katz, thank you so much. In a world of with a volatile landscape in health practice and health knowledge, you have delivered a very cerebral and grounded presentation for us all. And I know I speak on behalf of all of us. We're very, very grateful. Thank you so much for being here back and back with us again.
Great to be with you. Thank you all. Everybody stay well. Take good care.
You will. Take care.